Donald Trump talks to Iran and makes life very complicated for Israel's prime minister. There are accusations of Israeli killings of a group of paramedics, the row continuing over that. And we will have a conversation with a lead hostage negotiator for Israel about what it's like to be in that room. It's Unholy. I'm Jonathan Friedland in London.
And I'm Unit Levy in Tel Aviv. Unholy, two Jews on the news who have some news, incidentally, because we will have a live event. Actually historic, because Jonathan and I will be in the same room, which hasn't happened, I don't know, very, very long time. But it is our first live event, and we're very excited. Unholy Live coming to London, June 8th. More information and tickets in the show notes, but you might have noticed that it's closer to Jonathan's hood than to mine. Some of us will just cross the road and be there, and others will need to get on a plane, get hotels, sleep in other places that are strange to them. You know, when is the Jewish guilt kicking in? I'm just wondering, because I can go on.
It's kicking in. No,
Okay.
It's true. I will have to get on the tube. I think it's about 7 or 8 stops. So, you know, the hardship is not only yours. No, we are very excited about this. Our first ever live event. We've got some fabulous guests lined up. I think we're not yet announcing. It's a phased plan, but we will tell you all about that. And as Yonit says, details all there in the show notes. Tickets are already going. I'm very excited to tell you that. And we're looking forward to it. It'll be a lovely summer evening on the South Bank. I'm sure the sun will shine. It's the Queen Elizabeth Hall, which is a lovely venue. And we look forward to that. And we will do lots of things. It's going to be, you know, there's going to be music and sort of entertainment, as well as talking about the news. No music or entertainment for you and me right now, Yoni. We're just going to plunge right in. I mean, we've got the big interview coming up. We'll tell you more about that as we get closer to it. But just in terms of this week, it's been, I mean, it always is, but it's jammed partly because of what's going on inside Israel, but also the noises coming out of Washington and the news machine that is Donald Trump. I mean, this big announcement that he's going to build it himself, something big, etc., for Saturday with these talks with Iran.
Yeah, you know, my favorite ever children's book, obviously after King Winter's Birthday by Jonathan Friedland. My second favorite children's book is Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day. I love that book. But if you could just switch the word Alexander and Netanyahu, that would probably explain that day he had on Monday with the press conference, the president saying that there are going to be direct talks with Iran beginning Saturday. From everything that I've managed to sort of read between the lines and the information coming out, and, you know, the Netanyahu's people trying very quickly to say he wasn't surprised by this. I think his visit, in a way, his rush visit to Washington was an attempt to maybe change that a little bit, that he knew that was coming, but that didn't help. So that was the comments made by the president. By the way, a few other comments didn't play in Netanyahu's favor either. Netanyahu expected some sort of relief in the tariffs. That happened later, and not only for Israel, but in other regards. The president said again, reiterated that he wanted to see the end of the war in Gaza, and also said great things about Erdogan. None of this helpful for Netanyahu internally, but specifically what we want to discuss is the Iranian story. I think we should say that what Israel is concerned about, and I think we might hear a little bit of that with our conversation later in our show, is that who are the people who are running this operation from the American side. What we will hear from Oren Setter soon is he will talk about the fact that the deal that was pressured by Donald Trump to sign, the hostage deal, the details of that deal were already ready, prepared by the Biden administration. Then Netanyahu had to sign it, was pressured by the Trump team to sign it, but the details were there. Here, we don't really know what the details or what the contours of this deal will be, and there are many in Israel concerned. They're also not exactly sure who the people, I mean, we know Steve Witkoff is the man who's dealing with these negotiations as well, but who are the people in the sort of administration that are actually going to be dealing with this?
Yeah, I mean, not the main point, but by the way, Steve Witkoff and his ever-expanding portfolio, just thoughts and prayers at this moment for Marco Rubio, whose job as Secretary of State just gets ever smaller as each important chunk of it gets sliced off and given to real estate buddy Steve Witkoff instead. And now, to add to Ukraine and Gaza, now the Iran file is handed to him. I'm sure Marco Rubio will be happy being the envoy to Liechtenstein and the lower Benelux countries, or whatever part of the job is left. Not the main thing. Just something on the circumstance of this. I think your reading of it is exactly right. That in order to sort of window dress the fact that he had really blindsided Netanyahu, Donald Trump speaks to Netanyahu when Netanyahu is on a visit to Hungary. He's seeing Orban in Budapest, and then, essentially gets a call saying, yeah, let's talk, and maybe you should come here. And you can picture Netanyahu going, oh, let me get the diary. June is looking good. What about July? And then he says to Trump, no, I think you really need to get here now. I've got something to tell you. And then tells him, look, I'm going to talk to the Iranians. As you said, very discomforting for Israel, alongside all those other things, including praising a really sworn enemy of Israel's, Erdogan of Turkey. So that how you read all that, plus the fact that Israel was not exempted from this wave of on again, then off again, now paused tariffs of 17%. I mean, to me, it just confirms there was no diplomacy in these tariffs. Lots of people here in London have been praising the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, saying, God, what a brilliant job he did, offering a royal visit and so on, a state visit to Trump. No, there was a formula for these tariffs, very possibly generated by artificial intelligence. They asked ChatGPT, just spit out some numbers. No matter how good America's relations are with these countries, it spat out a number. For Israel, the number was 17%. Those were going to be the tariffs. Britain, it was 10%. To do with the trading
That sounds like you're
patterns.
showing off, Jonathan. Kind of sounds like you're showing off a little bit.
The point is that there are people here who are showing off, but it's so deluded. It's delusional. It's nothing to do with the merits. Obviously, Netanyahu and Trump are politically close. It didn't make any difference. They were, it was slapped on them. So yeah, as you said, a very no good, horrible, terrible, bad day, or whatever the title is for Netanyahu. But of all of those, yes, he will be feeling most blindsided about the talks for Iran. And it's just a reminder of the conversations we did have, didn't we, during the late stages of the election campaign, when lots of people, particularly on the Israeli right, were getting excited about the possibility of a Trump presidency. I think both of us were saying, careful what you wish for. There's he's transactional, that word about Donald Trump. There are no real loyalties. If he thinks there's a deal to be made with Iran, even if it discomforts Israel, he'll do it, as long as it benefits him. And so I think, you can imagine there being anxiety in the Netanyahu office right now. As you and I speak, it's just, 36 hours away from that meeting beginning in Iran.
Yes. And also, I think we should look forward a little bit more into the month of May, where we know that the plan is for Trump to visit Saudi Arabia. This all fits somehow, if we're looking for that logic in the Trump universe, right? And are we heading for, we'll know this after Pesach, but are we heading for this Trump administration saying to Netanyahu, you got to end whatever it is in Gaza, sign a deal, and let's move forward to other things? At the moment, everyone, all eyes on what will happen on Saturday, and that those negotiations, at the beginning of negotiations. At the same time, Trump is still keeping the option on the table, saying there's an obvious thing to do here, which is to strike Iran, and that is still on the table. I think it's important to also kind of notice that what is being said from the Steve Witkoff team to the hostage families is, we're continuing on this. We're going to move forward. This is going to happen. Right now, what's on the table is a sort of conversation or a sort of framework, something between 5 that Hamas agrees to hostages being released, to 11 that Israel demands, something between 50 to 70 days of a ceasefire. So that is moving in some sort of direction. That we said for a long time, the time is running out for the hostages. That is very clear. We have passed the 1.5 year mark since October 7th.
Yeah, I think I was in a way making a joking point about Witkoff's ever-expanding brief, but there's a real relevance here, which is one of the things the hostage families felt good in relation to Steve Witkoff was the fact that it was his, right at the start, it seemed to be his sole portfolio. It was his sole focus. It was a big priority. The nature of government and politics is bandwidth is limited. There are only so many hours in the day and capacity. If he now has more and more tasks, inevitably, even if and I know the hostage families feel this, that his heart is in the right place. Even if it is, there's just less capacity. And I would say that if you compare, and we're going to talk about this with our guest, but the intensity of activity around January the 20th, when Trump was inaugurated, compared to now, it's obviously a lower priority. It is less of a focus than it was, and that's why I think this sort of diffusion of energy that's coming out of the Trump team, where it's Ukraine one minute and it's tariffs the next, it does not augur. I do wonder about this with the leverage point, that he keeps making. He's done it now with Iran again. That if you don't do this, there's going to be huge consequences. At what point do people stop believing Donald Trump's threats? Because he's done it again this week, backing down on, I know they're going to spin it, the art of the pause now rather than the art of the deal, this 90-day pause. But at some point, people are going to begin to think this guy is just all talk. And that's quite a dangerous dynamic, because then Trump may feel he has to prove he's not all talk and it's just a mercurial, unstable operation, Washington now, and I'm putting it quite kindly, and that does not help people in the Middle East and people in Israel who are human clock here in terms of getting those people out.
Yes, I mean, this declaration of the president, coming from the president, talking about direct talks. At the same time, there is a boosting of U.S. Military presence near Iran. So there is some certain logic to saying, this is the credible threat on the table. Now let's write a deal. But I'm just to reiterate again, in Israel, what I hear from the defense echelon is that the fear is that the details are very important on this deal, obviously. And let's remember, this is the same president that tore up the first Iran deal, the JCPOA. So now it will be interesting. I'm sure there will be a few Democrats who will enjoy hearing him explain why his deal is much better than the deal he tore up. But all of it will be in the details and in what can be done to prevent this nuclear ambition of Iran to move forward. It has been moving very, very rapidly forward.
Yeah, and it would be so on brand, actually, for Trump to end up getting a deal that is almost identical to the one he tore up and then praising it as a great victory. That would be very on brand. Look, obviously, his announcement of those direct talks with Iran made big news internationally. But that aside, the story that has cut through, not just this week, but last week as well, in terms of international media attention, not sure how much it's really playing inside Israel, but outside, this has been on front pages around the world. And that is this claim by the Palestine Red Crescent Society that 15 of its paramedics were killed by Israel in an Israeli attack that it says, the Palestine Red Crescent Society, was deliberate, and indeed they call it a war crime. Israel has said it's investigating it. It has said that 6 of those men killed, and it now does admit, the Israeli military, that it killed those 15 men. 6 of them were identified as Hamas terrorists, they say. They have not given evidence of that. One of the reasons why this has been cut through is that the details of it on their face look so bad. So that some of the bodies found with their hands tied, the bodies buried, the vehicles they were in bulldozed, which fed a narrative that this had been somehow covered up, that it had been a deliberate killing of paramedics, and that it had been covered up. But also that Israel's own account of what happened has shifted. So Israel has, answers to some of these questions. They say, for example, that the bodies were not buried, they were covered with earth, and that's something that's standard protocol. But details that they presented have since been disproved. For example, they said that these emergency vehicles, had their lights off, which was suspicious. Then video was found, taken from a camera that was found on one of the bodies of the dead men, which contradicted that account, that showed that at least some of the lights on the vehicles are on. So this has kept the story going and going and going, because the video, videos that have been, for example, the New York Times, The Guardian, others have been publishing these, saying these contradict the Israeli account. That is partly why I think the story has gone on and on. Israel saying it's investigating it, but a lot of the domestic Israeli politics that you and I are going to get onto and talk about does not make the news outside Israel. This story absolutely has.
Of course it does, because it highlights a problem of trust. And I think that the international media has had that issue with the IDF spokesperson's unit. I would claim, at least to begin with, not for very good reasons, but that was the case to begin with. And when you come out with a version and then you have to, I mean the IDF, and then you have to walk it back and say that you're investigating, then there's an issue here. Now, there's a new IDF spokesperson, a very serious person, Efi Defrin, replacing another very serious person, Daniel Hagari. But these are the moments where I think this still happened in the Hagari tenure. But these are the moments when you need to be very, very direct and very clear on what the version is. I don't know who is to blame for at least the first version, but of course it is very important to have that sort of trust to the extent that you can. If we are on the issue of the war, I think it's important to say something else that is happening as we speak now on Thursday afternoon. Reservists in the Israeli Air Force signing a letter calling for the end of what they call a political war in Gaza. The response being very swift from the chief of staff, the new chief of staff, Eyal Zamir, saying he will dismiss those who signed the letter and are still in active duty. There aren't many that are still in active duty. We should go back to the days before October 7th, Netanyahu beginning with his judicial overhaul and reservists in the Air Force threatening not to show up if he continues. To this day, there is an argument within the Israeli society. Some people say that those pilots are to blame for October 7th because they signaled to the enemy that Israel is weak. The point is that this brings back that discussion whether or not reservists have the political power to do this if they think the war is indeed political. That is what is happening right now as we speak, and it perhaps gives us the segue to also talk about what happened this week in the Israeli High Court of Justice, where all of the arguments that are, I think all of the arguments that are very, very much alive in the Israeli society all poured in to the courtroom where the discussion was whether or not the government, the prime minister, can fire the head of Shin Bet, Ronen Bar.
Just before we get to that, I think the reservists' letter, which is, as you say, just emerged as you and I speak, it's an important test for the new chief of staff. This notion of, dismissing all of them or cracking down on those reservists, that's an indicator of how he, perhaps it's a sign anyway, of how he sees the job. And it's a very, political decision to make. And I too went back as soon as I heard about this to that moment. And you'll remember that about, in the lead up to October 7th, Yoav Gallant did warn. That was one of the things that led to his first, the firing that never was, that he was warning the prime minister, saying, when you have the country torn apart like this over then the judicial coup, and you have reservists saying they're not going to turn up for training and so on, that leaves us vulnerable. Our enemies will see this. And so that was a warning. So you don't have to blame the reservists for that. Rather, you can blame the politicians who did not act on those warnings and say, okay, let's pull back from tearing the country apart and, plunging us into a civil war because it makes us vulnerable. So I think, there's two ways of looking at the same thing. But I think all eyes on the new chief of staff and how he handles this. But yes, as you say, it comes while there was high drama. I think you and Matty talked about it on the podcast last week, how Qatargate has just intensified, but dramatic scenes in the courtroom where it really spilled over. Very unedifying scenes, I might add.
Yes, I mean, what we saw is protesters disrupting the proceedings so severely that the judges were forced to suspend the hearings and to order the protesters, we should say, out of them also a member of Knesset, Tali Gottlieb. This is important that when part of the legislature comes into a courtroom to disrupt the discussions, it was also mentioned by Chief Justice Amit to her, but they had to actually take her out of the courtroom. It was decided by the judges that the representative of the families whose relatives were killed on October 7th and wanted to speak against Ronen Bar, he did have the opportunity to do that. But the whole thing is a very serious argument and conversation inside the Israeli society because of the fact that legally and just on, theoretically, yes, the government and the prime minister have the right to fire the head of the Shin Bet. The issue here is that this certain head of Shin Bet, Ronen Bar, is investigating Netanyahu's own advisors in a scandal called Qatargate, that they receive money from Qatar while Israel is fighting a war against Hamas. So the decision to dismiss him can be claimed to be a conflict of interest, and under the reasonableness clause that we talked about a lot when the judicial overhaul was the top agenda. But what happened at the end of the day, after 11 hours, we should say, of deliberations, including the fact that the government had to essentially hire a lawyer because the attorney general, whose job is to represent the government, said that she would not. Gali Baharav Miara, she says that Ronen Bar does not need to be dismissed. The conclusion is that now there is an interim injunction. Ronen Bar must remain in office. The two sides have been ordered by the court to find a compromise. Spoiler, it will be, let's say, the chances of the attorney general who objects to firing Ronen Bar and the government that wants to fire Ronen Bar to arrive at a compromise is the same, like the chances of the Trump administration finding a coherent tariffs, plan. So I wouldn't bet on that. At the end of the day, what might very well happen is that the Supreme Court will decide that the government cannot, at this time, fire Ronen Bar, or the minimum, sorry to use the word, bar on this might be that the Supreme Court says, the High Court of Justice rather, will say, if you want to fire him, you have to go through the same procedure as appointing him, which means you have to go through a committee. We know that in Israel, going through a committee means the whole thing is delayed for several reasons for a long time. That is where we are right now. The Justice Minister, Yariv Levin, saying that if the High Court of Justice says that Ronen Bar has to stay in power, he thinks that the government needs to ignore the head of the Shin Bet, ignore the head of the Internal Security Service while Israel is in a time of war. This is where we have arrived at this point. We might also add that the former head of Shin Bet, Yoram Cohen, said this week that Prime Minister Netanyahu asked him to disqualify his political rival, Naftali Bennett, and say that he cannot be a member of cabinet when they were in the same government together. All of this in a mere 24 hours in Israel.
I want to just linger for a moment on those scenes in the courtroom, though, because I think they say something, or they pose a kind of profound danger. If the judiciary is not allowed to exercise its function, that is yet another direct challenge to the rule of law. And there have been many already, with this attempt to push out the attorney general. We've talked before about this weird symbiosis that's developing between Washington and Jerusalem, in this sense that the Trump administration is defying the judges, it's defying the courts. What's happened this week in Israel was to take that up a notch, where you have actual politicians in a courtroom barracking and shouting and preventing a judicial proceeding going ahead. If you're at a point in thinking, who exactly is inspiring who? Will there now be sort of MAGA people going into courts and just shouting and screaming so the judge can't do it? So the court system seizes up. Again and again, Yariv Levin and others are talking about the will of the people. The people must be heard. By people, they just mean a coalition that has cobbled together a narrow majority in the Knesset. That's the people. And they must be allowed to govern unimpeded, unconstrained. No judge, no law can get in their way. And when they do, or when they just try and do the usual wheels of justice to turn, they will gum up the works. You mentioned Tali Gottlieb, herself a lawyer, in the court, in the sort of public gallery, making a noise. This is a real danger to the sort of liberal democracy, as understood, democratic norms functioning in Israel. It's upped the ante. There's defying judgments, and now we're at a new stage, which is not even allowing judgments to happen because you don't let the courts happen. This is a moment I think we should sort of not just pass on, even before we get to all the other things you mentioned, which is the idea of saying that, if the guy stays in his post, the head of domestic intelligence, Ronen Bar, then we will ignore his advice, as you say, in a time of war. There is a sort of governmental crisis, a democratic crisis going on, and this was an eruption of it in a very vivid form that mustn't be allowed to just pass. It's not sort of routine. It's not a normal thing. And part of that, I think, we'll just mention this poll saying some 27% of Israelis think that the Qatar Gate story, which is in a nutshell that the idea that people in the employment of the prime minister were on the payroll of the Qataris, a shocking development. Ron Embar investigating it, 27% think that is fabricated, that Ron Embar himself fabricated it. Again, the parallel with America, where there is a sort of MAGA base that is in its own reality, its own news filter bubble, and believes, black is white and night is day. You're seeing a very equivalent phenomenon in Israel. Again, that poses a real danger to the democratic health of the country.
So, yeah, I mean, the same poll that came out, that is our network's poll from Sunday. And another interesting sort of detail from that is that for the first time, Naftali Bennett, head of a party that we don't know what its name will be, we just know Bennett 2026 is the name of it now, is for the first time passing the Likud when asked who you would vote for, which is significant. Bennett has already been ahead of Netanyahu in the question of compatibility, who's fit to be prime minister. That has been going on for a while. But the fact that a party that no one knows anything about yet, besides the fact that Bennett might head it, is already passing the Likud is interesting. Another party that is sort of gaining momentum, and we've been seeing this constantly in the polls, is Yair Golan, head of of the Israeli left, basically, which is Labor and Meretz, now called the Democrats. He's at 16 seats. This is, again, consistent, interesting in a week in which Golan is saying very clearly Netanyahu needs to stop being prime minister under the incapacitation law. But again, I think what the sentiment in the center left in Israel is finally someone who's, saying the things very clearly and not ever, there's no danger that Yair Golan would ever join in a coalition with Benjamin Netanyahu, say the people who would potentially vote for him, which is of course not true for people like Benny Gantz.
Now, through all of this politics, and polling is showing it, but also everything we've talked about for the last 18 months, obviously in the forefront of our minds has been the plight of the hostages. We've talked about it, from October the 8th onwards. It's one of those things that I think unites Israelis and the Jewish world outside, the care and fear for the plight of the hostages. We've talked often about the hostage negotiations, but we very rarely hear from the negotiators, the people actually in the room doing that. And that's why the exclusive and very rare conversation we're about to have, I think, is so special.
Retired Brigadier General Oren Setter has had a 30-year career in the IDF. His last formal role was head of the Strategic Planning Division, so he's also one of Israel's leading experts on Iran. That will come up later in our conversation. Crucially, for a little over a year, beginning October 8th, 2023, he was a lead negotiator on the Israeli hostage task force, which means he was in the rooms where it happened, and it is a rare opportunity to hear from him about these negotiations, the process, the opportunities seized, the opportunities missed, and so much more. Oren, thank you so much for talking to us today on Unholy.
Thank you. It is my pleasure.
I just want to anchor us in a timeline before we begin. So the first hostage deal began at the end of November and the beginning of December 2023. You were very intensely involved in that, mainly women and children coming out in that deal. The second hostage deal, more than a year after, began January 2025. The first phase is now over. The second phase, not yet. And there are still, as we said, 59 hostages held in Gaza. Between the two deals, many attempts made to arrive at another deal. And we will discuss, I think, what is the main considered the main missed opportunity somewhere between May and July of 2024. So if we can open up to ask about the here and now, because we seem to be stuck in that area between phase 1 and phase 2 of the second hostage deal. Hamas is saying it won't release any more hostages unless Israel says it agrees to the end of the war and withdrawing its troops. Israel is saying we're not agreeing to anything like that until Hamas is demilitarized and giving up its position in Gaza. How does one solve that?
Originally, in the three-phased deal, the idea was to hold the negotiations during phase 1 and try to go continuously into stage 2, where there will be an end of war and the release of the remaining hostages. As we all know, that has not happened, and fighting is resumed in Gaza. And now I think the challenge, similar to what we had in previous phases, is to try to synchronize the military pressure, the international political pressure, and the formation of an agreement that both sides can live with. And this is becoming more and more difficult as we move between the phases, because there are, on one hand, the tension between end of war and the defeat of Hamas and release of hostages is becoming more and more acute, and there are less and less hostages in Gaza. So for Hamas, every remaining hostage is becoming, I don't know to use the term, but it is more expensive to give it up. There are relatively few left in their perspective. On the other hand, for Israel, in trying to both defeat Hamas and to get to a negotiated agreement with Hamas is almost a paradox. And while all these efforts are synchronized, the military effort, political effort, and getting to an agreement, I think the one thing that could ultimately allow getting to a deal is similar to how we got to the last deal, a decisive pressure by the President of the United States. Someone needs to set a deadline, a credible deadline, that all sides we need to converge and make the hard decisions that need to be made in order to get to an agreement. Otherwise, this can just go on and on with a lot of suffering to all sides, and particularly to the hostages who are still there.
I just want to pick up on the word and the point you made about how it gets more expensive as you get closer to the sort of end stage that we're at now. And a point I hear often is people saying, when there are so few living hostages left, surely from their own logic, Hamas's logic, they become more and more unlikely to give them up, because the hostages are the only asset they have left. Horrible to talk about human beings in terms of assets. But when Hamas had dozens and dozens and dozens of people, they had some cards. Now they have so few. What could possibly motivate them to give up, as it were, the last hostage? Because once they've done that, they will be so, as they would see it from their point of view, so vulnerable.
I think the idea right now is to apply the military pressure on Hamas. And what we saw also in previous rounds is that it takes military pressure time to build up, in a sense that there is the pace of operations on one side. On the other hand, there is the issue of the felt pressure by Hamas. They need to feel under pressure. And that takes time. It's not that as soon as the operations start, they are under pressure. They are an extreme terrorist organization. They know how to handle pressure. But after a while, we saw in previous rounds, after several weeks of operation, at some point they feel under pressure. And so they have an additional motivation besides the issue of the hostages, also to alleviate the pressure from themselves and from the population, but mostly on themselves. And this is the tricky part in the negotiations, is how you synchronize all of these processes together, because you want to get to an agreement when the pressure is maximized on Hamas, when they feel that they are under pressure, and then they are more flexible and can compromise on some of the things that to begin with they don't compromise. And I can give later on some examples from previous rounds of these negotiations. Ultimately, there will be a difficult decision that will need to be made also on our side. As you say, it's hard to imagine an agreement where they sign their own full defeat. But I think that given enough pressure, and at some point they can get to a position where an agreement could be made that significantly weakens their control of Gaza, while at the same time allows the release of the remaining hostages. And at least from my personal perspective, the sense of urgency with releasing the hostages after seeing the conditions that they are held in is now the most critical matter in bringing the remaining ones alive and those that have died and have been murdered, to bring them to burial back in Israel. That's the priority.
On this point about military pressure on them, on Hamas itself, the one factor why this is so perilously difficult is that military action by Israel, first, it doesn't always just put pressure on Hamas. It obviously puts pressure on Palestinian civilians, which is different from Hamas, because our understanding of Hamas is they don't really care about their own people. So if Palestinians in Gaza are dying, that's no great problem for Hamas. So I'm interested in what pressure is. But secondly, what makes it so hard is military action can endanger the lives of the hostages themselves, because the buildings they're held in, no one knows where they are. They could be themselves killed under Israeli military pressure. So, and I know this is not exactly the role you're in because you're in the room negotiating, but how does Israel work out the military pressure so it comes to bear on the Hamas decision makers rather than on ordinary people in Gaza and Israeli hostages held in Gaza?
Right, that's a great question. And while, as you said, I was in the negotiations team, there was close coordination. There is close coordination between the negotiations team and the planners of the military operations, both strategically but also tactically, because of the reasons that you mentioned. And I will. These are two separate issues that I will address separately. On the first one, the IDF is going after Hamas military targets. Now, because of the way Hamas operates, it also has direct effect on the civilians in Gaza, because they are intertwined, and the tunnels are under buildings where people live. But the objective is to hit Hamas military targets and go after their leadership, after command and control centers, after ammunitions, after places where they try to rebuild the rockets, etc., etc. And that, with time, creates pressure. Now, it's not, I wouldn't say that Hamas completely doesn't care about what happens to the population, but I agree that they are much less sensitive than, for example, a democratic government cares about its own civilians. But the pressure is aimed at Hamas, and mostly at Hamas leadership, and getting them to the point where they see that their battalions, their platoons are getting destroyed, and for them to need a ceasefire for that. This is one element, and we see that it works, and maybe it works slower than it would have been if we had no restraints at all, but it works. And we see that after every time, when it was first in Gaza City itself, then in Khan Yunis, in Rafah, and also now I'm sure that within several weeks we will see Hamas under pressure. The other element is keeping the hostages alive. And the hostages task force that I've been a part of, the vast majority of people who serve there are serving for that purpose, trying to understand where there are hostages, where could be hostages, and coordinate each and every IDF activity to minimize the risk to the hostages. And so it is a lot of effort. It has a significant impact on the operations, but the priorities are clear. And so in that regard, it is a deliberate effort to keep them alive and to tailor the operations around these constraints in order to hit Hamas targets. Now, obviously, there are points where there are things that we don't do because while they are, and Hamas are not stupid, sometimes they know where they put the hostages to try and prevent us from doing things that would have been of high value. But we are able to circumvent that and find other pressure points on Hamas to get to the military pressure.
I mean, just if we zoom out for a moment, I can't think of any example in history of such a complicated hostage negotiation. These are civilians and not soldiers. There's a war going on. The youngest is 9 months old, Kfir Bibas. The oldest is 86-year-old Shlomo Mansour. The enemy is not yet defeated. I mean, this is there's so many moving parts. Even just a decision of how many, again, this sounds so callous and insensitive, but how many prisoners do you release for Israeli soldiers? How many do you release for Israeli civilians? Can you go into a little bit about that, just that apparatus of starting even to negotiate this? I mean, we said you kind of joined on October 8th. Israel didn't even know how many hostages, I think, at that moment even were held by Hamas. How does this work on a sort of day-to-day level?
So I think, first of all, it's worthwhile to highlight why these negotiations are so challenging. And you touched upon some of the points. So first of all, this is really a life and death. Often when you deal with national security, it's life and death, but often in a more abstract way. You say, we'll talk later about the Iran nuclear program. It's a life and death issue, but more abstract and more into the future. Here, we have names, we have faces. So it makes everything much more complicated and emotional to begin with. Second, this is negotiations with an extremist terrorist organization. That they try to be vicious not only in the way that they operate, but also in the way that they negotiate. And many of the elements of uncertainty as to who are the hostages, who will be released, are things that Hamas is doing in purpose. They know that it causes suffering, and this is something that they want to maximize. So you're negotiating with someone who does not negotiate in good faith in any way, but in bad faith, if I may say. The third element is, as you said, we negotiate in the middle of a war, a raging war. And so the negotiations themselves are much more than an exchange agreement. Hostages for prisoners, as terrible as that is, but there are many more factors ceasefire, the humanitarian assistance, the redeployment of IDF forces, etc., etc. Many elements. So it's a complicated agreement in its dimensions. There is the element of what we talked about earlier, that we have several objectives to this war. We want to release all hostages, but we also want to defeat Hamas. So how that plays also into the negotiations. It had a significant effect. And finally, even the process of negotiations is very difficult, because negotiations in this case are between leaders, between the Israeli leadership and Hamas leadership. But it goes through many points in the middle. There's the Israeli leadership, there's the Israeli negotiations team. Then there are three mediators, the Qataris, the Egyptians, and of course the United States. So that even when you have you have an agreement with the government in Hebrew, you translate it to a proposal in English, you transfer it to the mediators, they look over it, they have questions, clarifications, then they translate to Arabic, turn it over to the Hamas leadership in Doha, the external leadership, who also may have questions and comments, and only then they transfer it to Gaza, which is difficult. And when the operations are ongoing, it's even more difficult for them to get it inside Gaza, for the leadership in Gaza to make their deliberations and then turn it back. So from a proposal that comes out of Israel on the example of May 27th, the formal response by Hamas, we get it by July 2nd. So a month goes by just for the back and forth, which in normal business negotiations happen in real time. You sit across the table and you can talk. Here, everything is much slower.
So it's fascinating to hear that you obviously missed what negotiators talk about a lot, which is what you see eyeball to eyeball in your adversary or your interlocutor and what you learn from them. And I'm quite interested just to hear, even through all these layers, what you learnt about Hamas and how they think, even though you were going through all these intermediaries. But the other very particular thing, and it's obvious why I'd be interested in this, but is the role of Qatar. Because people are fascinated, even separately from what's going on domestically in Israel, that Qatar plays such an ambiguous and complex role in world affairs, whether or not you trusted them as a mediator, whether you felt they were operating in good faith, and maybe this is just a very simple bit, but what leverage they really had over Hamas. I mean, we know in the past, obviously, that money and so on, but right now, when Hamas is under fire over the last 18 months, what pressure does Qatar have over Hamas?
Right. So starting from your first question, so yes, we were able to elicit a better understanding of Hamas through those talks. I'll give a specific example. In the round of negotiations from December to March, more or less, on last year, a core issue was the issue of the Netzarim corridor, that corridor that divides Gaza into northern Gaza and southern Gaza, which was a key point for Hamas, getting the IDF to withdraw and getting Gaza to be able to move back and forth on all areas of Gaza. And as we worked on it, we knew that for us it was a key issue. We knew it's a pressure point, but it was very important to learn from the mediators to what extent that is a critical issue for Hamas. And for example, would it be enough to allow the population to go back and forth from the south to the north, but perhaps through Israeli checkpoints? Or to what extent it is critical for Hamas that they will be able to freely travel from one place to the other, and trying to understand also to what extent it's an issue of the population or just a matter of having Hamas operatives going back and forth. And through that time, the mediators really highlighted that from all their talks with Hamas, this is the critical issue for Hamas when we talk about stage one. And while we try to apply a lot of pressure and present other, better exchange keys, this is how the technical term used for prisoner to hostages ratio, and try to play with some other parameters, we got from the mediators the message that this is for Hamas the only way to get to a stage one temporary ceasefire agreement is to have a withdrawal from Netzarim corridor. And this is at some point a message that we also conveyed to our military and political leadership. A lot of deliberations until the end. In the end, they understood that this is not something that we can save for stage two, but that we will need to do in stage one. Although we were able to do it under some level of inspection to really allow the population to go back and forth, but minimize the transfer of arms during that during that period. So this is an example of a message that we got from the mediators, that it was in the draft, but there are many things in the draft that you need to understand what is flexible and what is hard, and that was important to us. Going more broadly on the role of the mediators, you mentioned the word trust. I think the word trust is not really relevant to these negotiations. This whole negotiations happen in an atmosphere of mistrust. We trust no one, especially after October 7th. We trust ourselves. There's also the role of intelligence here. I obviously cannot go into details, but we have also some other independent means of having a better understanding of what Hamas wants and their way of thinking that also allows us to see to what extent the messages we get from the mediators are authentic. Now, the Qatari role, I have to separate the role of the negotiators that sit with us in the room, and there's the broader political pressure. First of all, in the room, I think that they really tried to play a role of a mediator that transfers the understanding and those deeper insights from one side to the other. So it's not only a text, but that you sit down and understand what is the logic behind everything, and try to explain to us what they understand from Hamas, and also try to explain to Hamas what they hear from us. And in that regard, their style of mediation was more that of someone who conveys things from side to side most of the time, and leaves it to both sides to compromise and get to an even point. And most of the time, that was their, say, style of mediation. There were some key points where there was real pressure, when we needed them to apply pressure on Hamas, and sometimes they applied pressure on us. As I said, on the Netzarim corridor, for example, they tried to apply pressure on us. Later on, towards the summer, we gave sent what is called the May 27th proposal, the one that was later endorsed by President Biden and by the UN Security Council. And then it was perceived as a move forward by Israel, as Israel really trying to get to an agreement, putting on the table a reasonable proposal with there were some key issues for us that we needed Hamas to agree. And that was the point where the Qataris and the Egyptians have used their leverage on Hamas. And they do have leverage. The fact that most of the external leadership resides in Doha, and they can say as many times as they want that they don't really care, and they can move from one place to the other. It's convenient to them to live in Doha, and that's one pressure point. The second, which is one of the things that Qatar is being criticized on, but this is what turns them into relevant mediators in that case, is the fact that they can provide money. They've provided funding to Hamas, and that if we talk about the reconstruction of Gaza, at least Hamas is building on Qatar to help finance and fund the reconstruction of Gaza in the future. And these are points of pressure of Qatar and Hamas. They don't use it often, they don't use it a lot. In some critical points, last summer and also towards the January agreement, we saw them apply that kind of pressure.
We're dancing around this May 27th issue, and I think I want to ask about that opportunity missed, to the extent that you can talk about this. So Israel is putting down its framework for a deal, the Biden administration adopting this deal, sending it to Hamas, coming back with an answer, as you said, July 2nd. What happened? Why didn't this work then?
Right. As you said, on May 27th, we put forward a new proposal. It is all within the framework that was put forward by the mediators in what was called the Paris Summit on January 28th, after which we exchanged several drafts since then. But one of the issues was, because it's a month-long process, if you start, again, excuse me for using the term haggle here, but if you try to, on every issue, move slow, only bit by bit, just the process could take years. And so at some point in May, we decided to take a significant move forward. We knew that the Rafah operation had started in early May. We expected pressure to be built on Hamas by June, July. And as I said, we need to synchronize all these processes. So we knew pressure is going to build up. We wanted to put forward a proposal that we thought that Hamas could accept. And in that way, wherever things were, we thought critical to Hamas, tried to be forward-leaning as possible within our interest, and make sure that everything that is critical to us is worded in a very careful way. The issue of the fact that it's not an end of war, but a temporary agreement, but in a way that allowed Hamas to accept it, and in a very delicate wording of that. the issue of releasing the women first, and within them, the civilian women first, within the first week after they were not released on the first agreement in November, and several other issues that were critical to us. And then we sent over this proposal. It was endorsed. Pressure was built on Hamas, both internally because of the military pressure and externally by the mediators. And on July 2nd, they provide back a rather positive response, I would put it this way, where they accept the key issues that we put, but it's not a yes. It's a yes, but. And they put forward a new draft that what they and the mediators expected was for us to say, okay, these gaps are reasonable. Let's go to Doha or Cairo, sit down for a couple of weeks to finalize all of these gaps. They also said in some of these issues, this is our current position, but we are flexible. If we come to the negotiation table, there's flexibility here on the issue of veto of prisoners, the number of prisoners, etc. There is some flexibility. And then what happened, the way I would describe it, is that from an Israeli perspective, there, first of all, some issues that we needed to ask ourselves, what is our position? For example, the Philadelphia corridor. It did not appear in the May proposal, because by the time the previous Hamas proposal was given before we had Philadelphia. And so it was an open issue. You can decide on a gradual withdrawal, you can decide to stay there. One example. So there were issues there that you can decide whether you want to be tough or flexible. And reminding you that it was a time when we had, in a sense, the upper hand. We were in significant military pressure on Hamas because of the Rafah operation. And the mediators were pushing Hamas. And now from an Israeli position, you have a dilemma, whether now when you have the upper hand, do you stay tough or do you become flexible although you have the upper hand? And to get to an agreement within the time frame of when we still have all of this pressure, we needed to be flexible although we had the upper hand at that time, which is not intuitive for negotiations. Usually when you have the upper hand, you are tougher. And this is, to me, the months of July and August, mainly July, when we were providing those clarifications to the May 27 agreement, saying that we will remain in Philadelphia, that we must have inspections in Netzarim, that we want more hostages to come out every week. Each demand by itself can be easily justified and is justified. Taken together, Hamas was balked at that, and even the mediators. And that meant that we spent several weeks again working, trying to see if there's flexibility here, flexibility there. At some point, Hamas felt they adapted to the military pressure. They became tougher also and started expanding their or increasing their demands when it came to the prisoners and the number of prisoners with life sentences that they want released. And instead of converging, we diverged. And the fact that this process has taken so many weeks ultimately led to the point where in the end of August, we understand that we cannot close the Philadelphia gap, we cannot close the prisoners gap, and we are basically in a crisis in the negotiation towards the end of August.
You're a professional and you're being very delicate here, and I understand. We should just mention that Yoav Gallant, who was then defense minister, was quoted as saying in a cabinet meeting in August, if you will continue, he said it to the government and to Netanyahu, if you will continue to insist on the Philadelphia corridor, we will lose the hostages. I'm not putting you on the spot on this. I'm just going to mention that is what they said at the time.
No, that's fine. I don't, not in the past, not now, and in the future, will not hide my personal opinions. But I am trying to portray sort of a more fair description of the situation. We, from negotiations team perspective, we said, and Minister Gallant, former Minister Gallant, put it very clear. We have a window of opportunity. By then we understood that the issue of military pressure is not infinite. The fact that at that point Hamas felt under pressure doesn't mean that a month from now they will still feel that. And so there was a window of opportunity when Hamas is flexible, that if we will be flexible, we can get to an agreement. If we will not be flexible, there's a chance we will get, maybe they will accept all our demands, but more likely than not, we will not get to an agreement. The pressure will wane, and we will have lost that opportunity, and then it takes months until you have another opportunity. And this is what happened. In that regard, it was a missed opportunity, in my view. If we were flexible then, and maybe in different terms than the ones that the final agreement took on, but it would have been in July rather than in January, which comes at a huge cost to life of hostages, of soldiers, and again, suffering altogether.
So why wasn't Israel flexible in that moment of opportunity?
The decision of the government, of the prime minister, was that some of these issues, in their eyes, were critical. For example, the Philadelphia corridor was seen or said by the government that it is strategically critical that we stay in the Philadelphia corridor. We said that from a military perspective, and this is what the chief of staff and then the minister of defense said, Philadelphia corridor is important, but it is worthwhile to have a gradual withdrawal from Philadelphia, in understanding that if we will resume operations after stage 1, we can retake Philadelphia corridor in a matter of hours, probably. Prime Minister said, no, this is a strategic issue. It's not a military issue, and we cannot withdraw from Philadelphia. This is an example of one of the issues that kept us apart from an agreement and didn't allow us to move forward to getting there. There are other people, also on the professional level, who thought that this is indeed Philadelphia corridor is critical. Personally, I don't think that it is that important to warrant another 6 months of negotiations until we get there. But that was the stated reason. Whether there are also other motivations behind that, I don't know. I cannot know, but we can all have assessments.
I can just assume that the sort of day that you hear of the fact that 6 Israeli hostages were murdered, that's the end of August, was one of the worst days that you had on this job.
Yeah, this is probably after October 7th itself, maybe the hardest day. As I said, we returned from Doha on August 30th, early in the morning. And so it was, and we understood that the month of August, we spent almost all the month in Doha and Cairo, trying intensively to get to an agreement. But by August 30th, we understood that we are in a deadlock and something else will need to happen to get to an agreement. So already we came back to Israel with a sort of grim feeling that we're not close to an agreement after several weeks of some optimism. And then we wake up the following morning on August 31st, starting to hear that there were 6 bodies found, and later on finding out who they were. And yes, it was devastating for all of us, both those who worked so hard to keep them alive, and then also for us trying to get them out in an agreement, especially that most of them were supposed to have been released on stage 1 of the agreement. And so it was the cost in that regard was very clear, vivid, and close to heart. And one of the challenges, and we had several of these points, this was maybe the most tragic and dramatic, but you have to wake up the following morning and you get even more motivation. You say, okay, we really need to see what we can do to at least get the rest of them out while they're still alive.
You're speaking with great sort of self-restraint and saying, I think, being very fair, because you're saying that point about the Philadelphia corridor, reasonable people held different views on it. What other people saw, including people who were really campaigning for the release of the hostages in Israel and actually outside, in the Jewish world, the community I'm in and so on, was that suddenly that red line in July became not a red line. 6 months later in January, it was no longer a red line. And therefore they thought there's something else here. And you hinted before that maybe there are other factors. And one of the things that was going on all the time there were reports that were always sourced in the Israeli media, that were sourced to members of the team that you were part of, saying, look, we sometimes make it, well, there'll be some progress, and then there'll be a statement from Jerusalem, from the government, that will undermine exactly the move we've made, that there was a sense that the political branch was not helping you. So I know how difficult this is, but I'm just thinking, how do you reassure those people here in London who were putting up posters of hostages, or campaigners in Hostage Square in Tel Aviv, that actually the political leadership was, despite what was written about in the Israeli newspapers, they were not undermining this effort to get the hostages back, and they were doing everything possible to get that release in July instead of waiting. Can you reassure them? Or if we're honest about this, we have to say there was some difference between what you were doing in the room and what the politicians back in Jerusalem were doing.
It's not my place to reassure anyone about the political leadership. I was there as a member of the professional team working on the negotiations. And in that regard, there is a very subtle difference between being tough in the negotiations and with having other considerations. I don't know, there's no clear way to separate the two. And when you are as part of the negotiations team, in a sense, it doesn't matter. Because you only work within the system. You can decide, and at some point I've decided to step away because I felt that at some point I felt that this is no longer, I'd say, a purely professional issue where I can contribute, that there is something else that is holding it back. But while I was in the team, anyway, you have to work within the system and to try and convince a certain decision can happen in Philadelphia, whether because you provide military or strategic explanations, or because you said that from the broader perspective, if we will not use this chance, it will be months before we will be able to release them, which indeed is what happened. And so you do it within that. I can say that the professional team is completely dedicated and working 24/7 to get the hostages out, and that we had very deep conversations with the political leadership. So it's not a matter of they do care. And I also accept the fact that they have broader considerations than we do, both strategically, perhaps also politically, I don't know, but there are broader considerations. For me, as a member of the professional team, the main issue is try to move forward and push forward as long as I feel that I can. And as long as I felt that there is something that I could do within the field of the professional team, I stayed there and pushed forward. And the moment that I felt that it is no longer a matter of if I will come up with a new formula of how to move forward or some new wording of the draft, but there is some decision that will be taken when it is taken, but it's no longer something that I can affect, I thought I'd be better step aside.
And that was at the end of October. So what changed in January that the Israeli government decided to go for this, that the other parties went for this? Is it just the Trump effect, or is it something more?
So I think there's more to it. First of all, I remind all of us on September, there was the pager operation against Hezbollah, and then there was 10 days that really defeated Hezbollah, and at some point there was a ceasefire reached with Hezbollah. And then also some exchanges with Iran that left Hamas more isolated than it was prior to that. Second, there was a military operation in northern Gaza, another one that also applied pressure on Hamas. So it was not only the Trump effect. These two issues had an effect on Hamas, and Hamas was again under pressure. But that by itself was not enough. And there was this one more thing needed, and that thing was the Trump effect. So, without that, I'm not sure if maybe we would have gone through another wave of them getting closer. We may be getting tougher because they're under pressure, and it could have continued. But the fact that there was in a sense, a rigid deadline, that January 21st, the inauguration day, added this element of pressure that was needed. So both sides can make the difficult decisions needed to get to an agreement. And also on the Israeli side, so yes, there was some change in our position in Philadelphia, although we all remember that we are now still deployed fully in Philadelphia. The number of prisoners and the quality of prisoners that were released was significantly increased in those last couple of weeks before the agreement. So there were some changes in the Israeli position that were also critical to get to an agreement, because the pressure on Hamas makes them flexible, but to an extent. And so there was needed flexibility on both sides, and the one person who could get that was President Trump by setting this deadline, and his envoy, Steve Witkoff, that sort of brought that pressure to the front and spoke with both Israeli leadership and the mediators to get to the agreement. And so it was not only the Trump effect, but I do believe it was a necessary condition to get to an agreement, and without it, it wouldn't have happened. I will just say one more thing, because maybe it will relate to the Iran discussion, that it was actually fortunate to have this transition between the two administrations, because while the Trump administration was able to bring in the pressure, it was built on that framework that we worked on for years. So everything was ripe for an agreement. Everything was there. All the details, all these complexities were mostly resolved. And it was that closing part of the agreement that allowed it to happen. Just pressure by itself would not have been enough if not for all of the preparatory work done by all the teams, the mediators, and the officials from the Biden administration who really worked hard on that throughout the year.
Yeah, I think that's very fair to give that credit. Often that gets overlooked, actually, what you just said. Well, you mentioned Iran. There's been action there with Donald Trump saying that there's going to be talks even this weekend. Something big is going to happen. Some people said, well, he's just trying to distract from all the tariff troubles. You're an expert on the Iran question. What's your assessment of what the Trump administration have in mind? Whether you think there is actually a prospect of some kind of grand bargain even between the United States and Iran? Just how do you assess it?
So I think this year has been slated to be a critical year when it came to the Iranian nuclear program. Because on one hand, the program has done a significant progress ever since the withdrawal from the JCPOA in May 2018, the previous Iran agreement. So it made a lot of progress, and it's on the verge of having just enough fissile material for a weapon, something that they can achieve within a week if they decide to do so. On the other hand, maybe the last piece of the JCPOA that is still in place, which is the ability of the E3 countries to snap back all of the UN Security Council sanctions that were put in place on Iran in the last 20 years, their ability to do this snapback sunsets on October 25. And this is maybe the last political leverage that the international community has on Iran without the veto power of Russia and China. The Europeans can do that by themselves through the Security Council. That's the mechanism that was built as part of the JCPOA. But it expires on October 25. And so it's obvious that sometimes between now and October 25, something has to happen with the Iranian nuclear program. And that something could be probably either of two options that will run side by side until there is a decision. One is the military option and taking a military action against Iran's nuclear program. And although it advanced significantly, also the capabilities and the planning and the intelligence on it have also progressed over the past several years. So this is one option. And the other is an option of getting to an agreement. And there will not be an agreement unless Iran feels under pressure and really feels that there is a credible military threat. And even in trying to get to an agreement, it's a very difficult one because Iran wants to maintain its capabilities. The US, Israel, the West do not want it to maintain them. So finding compromise here will be very difficult. And if there will not be an agreement, then probably somewhere before October 25, some action will need to be taken. So these two options will run side by side until there's either agreement or a strike. And in that regard, I think that the way President Trump has put it is correct. That these are the two options. And Iran and the world need to understand that these are the status quo, almost status quo we had over the past several years, is no longer sustainable. And so one of these two issues one of these two endpoints has to happen, either an agreement or a strike. And I think it's also, as you said, it's makes sense to make an effort to try to get to a deal before going to the military path, which is going to create significant damage throughout the Middle East. And as we all know, things that happen in the Middle East never stay in the Middle East, so it will cause trouble also elsewhere. Now the question is, what should a deal look like? And this is where I think things are going to be complicated, because on the one hand, we may say we want Iran to completely eradicate every remnant of its nuclear program and stay with nothing at all. On the other hand, this is going to be almost impossible with Iran, given that, first of all, it takes a lot of pride in its nuclear capabilities. It claims to have the right to have some of these capabilities, although it violated all of its NPT commitments over the years. And also, it's also important to say that strategically, Iran has lost some of its other elements of deterrence and power over the past year. The fact that they do no longer have Hezbollah, on the one hand, means that they are more vulnerable, but on the other hand, it means that they don't have this tool of power in their hand any longer. And also, while we've seen their missile capabilities, we've also seen the limits of their missile capabilities. And so from a deterrence perspective, when Iran looks around, it says, okay, I don't have that. I don't really have that. Giving up on my nuclear options might not end up well. Mm. And so it means, I think, that we need to come to some sort of a reasonable compromise. And in that regard, I think that what we learned from the failure of the JCPOA is that the next deal to me, it needs to be, I call it reasonable, extendable, and durable. Reasonable in a sense that it puts significant limits, verifiable limits on Iran's nuclear program that allow enough time to intervene if we see that Iran is again deviating from its commitments, and seeing that it really has only low-enriched uranium and small installations, etc., etc., and all of that being verified by the IAEA, which knows how to do that. Second is extendable, and this is one of the two fatal flaws of JCPOA, was that it provided Iran with permanent benefits, the permanent withdrawal of all of these UN sanctions after 10 years, for temporary limits, for 10 years limits. If nothing happens, then by October 25, Iran will no longer be a case in point for the UN Security Council. And getting it back there means all 5 permanent members need to agree, which is challenging these days. So they got permanent benefits for temporary limits. And for a next agreement to work, it has to be more asymmetric. If they want they agree to temporary limits, they will get temporary benefits. And so if that time expires and they want another term of temporary benefits, they should agree to another term of temporary limits so that the agreement could be extended, where the JCPOA was not extendable. And finally, it has to be durable. I think that for Iran to get to an agreement, it needs to know that it cannot be unilaterally withdrawn by by a future U.S. president by an executive decision, and there needs to be a way that Iran is also assured that you can never get 100% guarantees, but that there will be some repercussions if some other party to the next agreement withdraw from it, and that would make the agreement durable, so that it will really last through its last 3 days. And I think that an agreement that meets all of these 3 parameters is one that can be in the middle ground between what we need, Iran to never have nuclear weapons, but also with what Iran could agree to, which keeps its pride that is critically important for that regime.
Well, I certainly hope everyone dealing with this has listened to you, because if we just put it in the words of President Trump standing next to Prime Minister Netanyahu, he said, a deal is better than doing the obvious, and the obvious is something I don't want to do. Oren Setter, thank you so much for talking to us. We learned a lot from this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Yonit and Jonathan.
That was fascinating to hear from Oren Setter. I mean, he speaks with tremendous sort of calm and, as I mentioned there, I think self-restraint. But also, we've just heard so much about the hostage negotiations, this proposal, that proposal. To hear directly from someone in the room weighing up all these different calculations, these moral conundrums, as you were hearing there, and to hear how somebody was sort of wrestling with those and where they got to, I thought was fascinating, particularly interesting as well, hearing somebody talk about going through a negotiation which normally would be eyeball to eyeball, but instead having to go through layers and layers and layers of intermediaries, and how difficult, it turned a very difficult situation even more difficult. I found it fascinating to hear.
I can't remember, again, any case in the history of the world where this kind of complicated hostage negotiation was going on, and him taking us into these rooms, trying to understand, talking about how there's no faith between both sides, talking about that kind of diplomatic puzzle in which you have the hostages, you have the military operation. How do you coordinate both so you don't hurt the hostages? This is a man who lived and breathed this issue for more than a year. I think also interesting to hear why he decided to leave and what he says about it. I mean, this is just I think it was a fascinating conversation. I think that the fact that at the end of the day, he really does believe that they will be coming home is something that I'm kind of left with in that optimism. I think we have several awards to give out, as usual.
Why don't we begin with the chutzpah awards? I'm not sure how aware people are. There are elections going on in a way you could almost describe it as a kind of global Jewish parliament. It's not, that may be overblown, but the World Zionist Congress, an old sort of historic body, existed even before the state. There are elections underway. This is a body which has a big budget that spends money in Israel and outside Israel on the Jewish world. There are currently elections ongoing that often mirror the sort of political parties that you see inside Israel. 3 ultra-Orthodox parties, also seeking seats in this body, are currently being sued for bribery. The claim is that these 3 parties should be disqualified from the contest because it is said that they offered rewards to those people who would vote for them. The parties named are Eish Ha'am, which is affiliated with the Eish HaTorah Orthodox movement. Am Yisrael Chai, that's targeting young voters, particularly on American college campuses, and Eretz HaKodesh, a religious party, which targets voters in the Haredi community. They are accused of bribing people for votes. In this upcoming election, voting began on March the 10th. It's going to end on May the 4th. Those parties, of course, deny that, and they're fighting this. But it was heard this week in court. I think we've given chutzpah awards to ultra-Orthodox parties a few times before for their idiosyncratic approach to democratic elections. They often are the recipients, some might say, of inducements, financial inducements for their votes in parliament, where it is their religious academies and others that are on the receiving end of government largesse. According to this lawsuit, it is they who are currently the ones splashing the cash, trying to get votes. This court case is not going to be heard in the regular Israeli courts, rather in the Supreme Court of the Zionist movement. That's quite an archaic body. I didn't know that it had its own courts. It's the first time in its history that it's been asked to adjudicate a question of bribery. The details, I think, are going to make this one of those cases that you're going to want to follow, because the claim is that it wasn't just sort of cash payments that were made to people who either themselves voted for these parties or brought in votes, organized votes for them. Rather, they were, so says the claim, rewarded with expensive gifts, including flights to exotic destinations, vouchers to restaurants, electronic appliances, and here's my favorite, raffle tickets for prizes that included a 2-year lease on a Tesla car, which I just find funny because it's sort of, it's timely, while that car's value and popularity does decline. Luxury brand watch, a diamond bracelet, tickets to the Super Bowl. To qualify for these prices, ambassadors were required to provide proof of voting. So keep an eye on that case. As I say, the parties involved, I'm sure, do deny all of it. But more importantly, people will want to vote in those elections. We will come back to this topic, I'm sure, before the ballot voting closes on May the 4th. But this is a story. I think there's some chutzpah going on in this story. Let's just put it that way. I think the lawyers will allow us to get away with that claim.
I think so. Look, the American Jews can vote for their delegates between March 10th and until May the 4th. So yes, May the 4th has to be something that nerds who love Star Wars pause on. But in any case, we will return to this topic because this is a very important vote. It's a chance to make an impact on this body that has a lot of funds. Any U.S. citizen over 18 can do that if his or her primary residence is in the United States and it did not vote in the 2022 Knesset elections. It's very simple. It's all online. And I think it's an important vote beyond the story that you told. And yes, we will return to this because there's a lot of politics here going on. We like this story a lot. So we will be talking about it in one of our future episodes. For Mensch, I would want to suggest a young woman who is not just a true hero, but also the week that she has gone through is something that I think we should mention in a way in which the Israeli society, we talked about this a lot in this episode as well, is torn apart. The woman I would want to discuss is Liri Elbag. She is one of the Outlook soldiers that was abducted from Nahal Oz and was in Hamas captivity for 477 days. All accounts, hers and the others who were with her, describe a woman of really outstanding bravery in the way that she stood up for herself and for the other hostages that were with her. We might mention that Amit Susana said that Liri Elbag saved her life, which is, just one example of the way that this very young woman, conducted herself. This week, she said Netanyahu is to blame for October 7th, and he needs to fix what happened, i.e. bring back the hostages. All of these hostages that have returned are very, very much involved in the campaign to bring back their friends that are still in Gaza. She was inundated by a lot of hate online of Netanyahu's supporters. Again, a very young woman who went through 477 days of captivity. Of course, the backlash of that was a lot of love in her direction from everyone else in the country. And essentially this turning into just an example of how I think the society is really torn apart. At the end of the day, this is really a very, very brave young woman who I really hope that we will hear more from as the years go by.
Yeah, I think a worthy choice for all our awards this week. Before we do our thank yous, just a little mention of the fact that we are doing bonus episodes, as you know, if you are one of our subscribers via Patreon. Remember, patreon.com/unholypod. We've been doing bonus episodes. I think one of our recent ones was on the books we're reading and the books we're looking forward to. We've talked about When Harry Met Sally and Saturday Night Live. Those bonus episodes are now available on Spotify. I think you still have to do the bit of becoming a subscriber in the usual way. We want you to do that. But now Spotify have taken on our bonus episodes. So we're pleased about that. And we should do our thank yous.
We should also a big thank you to Michal Porat and to all of our listeners and to you, Jonathan. Chag Sameach.
And God, did we not even mention Pesach? This is so bad. I've got this huge job remaining of doing all the dishes. The stepladder is about to come out where I bring down the Pesach crockery. We haven't.
Okay, you got 60 seconds. Go. Come on, complain about Pesach.
I think a lot of our listeners will be listening to this while they prepare for Pesach. Non-Jewish listeners, this is when you have to get rid of anything that's sort of bread-related, chametz. It's so mad, really, when you describe it to anybody else. But for 8 days, you must banish anything that has even a crumb has got to be out. And so, by tradition, this is when I climb up the stepladder, reach for the Pesach cupboard, bring down the plates, the crockery, and there's lots of oohing and ahhing as you see glasses and cups that have sentimental value. It reminds me, and I know I'm not unique in this, it reminds me, of course, of my late mum who did this job, and I know lots of people. It brings back old relatives. It's a very sentimental sort of Proustian thing as we prepare for 8 days and 7 where you are for Passover. It is my favorite festival. I think I may have said that. I actually like eating matzah, for example. So Pesach is upon us. It's looming. And so Chag Sameach to anybody who's doing the stepladder maneuver. I'm with you in solidarity.
Can we have an extra bonus for subscribers, which is just a video of everything you just described? Can we do that? I'm wondering.
That would be a marketable product. Let's add it to our list. People want to see me as I'm scrubbing. That's going to be
at least this person wants
content.
to see you scrubbing. I don't know about the rest. I'd love to see you just scrubbing away. All right, we'll have to stop here, and we shall meet next time.
See you next time.